Good. All right, Miles, here we go.
Okay.
You were born in Jamestown, New York, 1922.
Correct.
And your father, talk about your dad. How about him?
My father was a New Yorker, city native, and born in I think 1893 or something like that. Graduate of DeWitt Clinton High School and New York University, and he went to work for what was then a small accounting firm started by a couple of brothers, M.L. and Frank Seidman. And my mother, a sister of the Seidmans, was working for the firm. She was probably a bookkeeper or something, running a adding machine or something. Anyway, she and my father met there, and eventually they were married. And the Seidman firm in World War I, one of the partners, Frank Seidman, worked for the government, I don't know what the correct name is, but cost department. And he was sent to Grand Rapids, where they were building wooden airplanes in those days, Grand Rapids then being the #1 furniture center. And he made a lot of acquaintances and friends there. And so after the war, the firm opened its second office in Grand Rapids. And then, and Frank Seidman ran that. And then in 1920, Jamestown, which then was another major furniture manufacturing center, and had some, the Seidman firm had some clients up here in Jamestown. Anyway, they sent my father to Jamestown in 1920 to open an office, which he did. And of course, my mother was with him. And I was born here in 1922. And, well, that's
how you got here.
That's how I got here, yeah, first class.
And went to Jamestown High School.
Yeah.
Did you have a favorite teacher or two?
Yes, it's interesting. I still remember some. In junior high, a couple that I remember are Lillian Dixon. There's now a school there. There was a school named after her. I think she was 7th or 8th grade English. And in high school, there was an English teacher named Bonnie Dean, who was very memorable. And of course, in hindsight, the good teachers were tough, fair, and that's how you learned. There was Bob Wilson. He taught history, and I don't want to get into all that, but anyway, yes, so I went through high school, graduated. Do you want me to continue this?
Absolutely.
And for some reason, way back when I was in junior high, my father got the idea that I was going to go to Dartmouth. I don't know, he must have had a client or somebody who was a Dartmouth alumnus, but anyway, that's where I was going to go. So when it came time to apply for college, I applied to Dartmouth. That was the only college I applied to. Fortunately, I was accepted. And so I went there, and World War II, of course, came on. I was in the class of 43 at Dartmouth, and of course Pearl Harbor occurred in December of 41, and I was allowed to finish because in those days if you joined a certain Navy programs, they let you finish college, which I did, and so I wound up in the Navy as a ensign. making more money than I'd ever made in my life in those days. But anyway, and then I also met my wife, Gloria, during those days. She was from New York, and, well, I won't go into that, but in any event, I'm wandering around here, but
No, that's
I
great.
was
So-
assigned to a ship. Oh, I had Special Navy training as an anti-submarine warfare officer, which meant that you went down to Miami and Key West, where in those days during the war there was anti-submarine training. And what that involved was having equipment on a ship called sonar equipment, and it did pinging. It sent a sound wave out into the water, and if some echo came back, that means you were in contact with something, and you were, if it was a submarine, you were to take certain steps, et cetera, et cetera. And that was my assignment, although I was on a small ship and there were only 8 officers, so we stood deck watches and everything else. I was, after graduating, if I can use that term, from the anti-submarine program, I was assigned to a ship being built in Portland, Oregon. It was called a patrol craft escort. It was a small escort vessel. Its biggest armament, it had a 5-inch gun on the bow. That was, but it basically was an escort ship to escort merchant ships and as anti-submarine warfare protection. And then we were assigned to the Aleutians. So our main duty became convoying merchant ships. In those days, the Japanese had just been evacuated or just left the Aleutians, and the whole Aleutian chain was American occupied. And our job was to convoy merchant ships that came up from Seattle and the West Coast along the Aleutian chain while they delivered supplies to our troops who were stationed around the Olympics. So we went up and down the Aleutian chain from Dutch Harbor on the east to Attu on the far west. And that was, we were based in Adak, which was in the kind of the central island in the Aleutians, and that was the headquarters of the North Pacific, Admiral of the North Pacific. And that was our base, Adak Harbor. And so we convoyed ships up and down, and in the winter, it was pretty rough, rough going. I was able to conquer my mal de mer, but some people weren't. In fact, I think it was psychological in the sense that as soon as we untied the lines from the dock and started heading out in the harbor, some people continued to get ill. I got over my seasickness more or less, but in the winter it was rough going in the Aleutians. And I don't know, fortunately though, we never ran into any enemy. The only time that we encountered something, we started hearing a pinging on the sonar equipment, and we, general quarters and everybody manned their battle stations, etc. And all of a sudden these lights went on in the distance, and it was a U.S. cruiser. Fortunately, we didn't fire on it because we would have been decimated. But anyway, that was my one semi-battle experience. But anyway, you got me roaming here.
That's great.
Gloria and I were married. It was one of those foolish wartime marriages in 1944. We were married in California, and that happened more or less because when our ship was on shakedown cruise in Long Beach, California, I ran into a college classmate and friend of mine who was stationed there in the Navy, and he was married. And Gloria came out to visit me, and they had a lovely little place on Redondo Beach, which was in a little seaside village of about 300 people. And we went up for dinner, and they said, "Why don't you guys get married?" And that was a different era. Marriage was sort of expected in those circumstances. And we thought, well, why not? So my captain allowed me a weekend off, and we were married in Long Beach, I guess it was, in a synagogue. And we spent our 2-day honeymoon at the Bel Air Hotel, which was and still is one of the spots in California. And as I recall, we called our parents about this, and my mother was not thrilled. Gloria's parents were. We had met, so I mean, they knew me, and they knew my parents, and they, I would say, accepted it. But anyway, the marriage has stuck all these years, and you've got me wandering around here. But anyway, then our ship was sent after the marriage and shakedown. We were sent up the Aleutians, and that's where we did duty. And on.
Did Gloria go back to New York?
Gloria went back to New York, and in fact got a job, a civilian job with the Navy Department in Manhattan. I don't remember now what it was, but it was down in 90 Church Street, which was the Navy headquarters in those days. But where was I? Oh, in August of 1945, our ship was ordered back to Seattle, or Bremerton, Washington Navy Yard, to be refitted as an escort vessel for the invasion of Japan. This was late July and August of 45, and we got down to Bremerton, went into dry dock, and they started, I don't know, whatever they were going to do to us, refit us, and the A-bomb was dropped, and I guess they didn't know exactly what to do with us after that. So they decided we were going to be a weather ship. In those days, of course, the weather, they had ships patrolling around out in the middle of the ocean and radioing weather details. They didn't have the electronic that we have now. And anyway, that time, the war ended. And our ship went out to Hawaii, but at that point I had enough points, as they were called in those days, to be discharged. So I never went out on a weather 30-day run. And so I came back. The biggest ship I was ever on was the USS Arkansas, which was an old battleship, and I came home on that, along with a bunch of other Navy people, to San Francisco, and then got a train across the U.S. And anyway, the war ended. It ended, and so there I was back in the States at the end of 45, and well, I don't know. You don't want me to go on, but.
Well, just a couple things. Obviously, when you were, the A-bomb was dropped. You're talking about that. What did you know about it? How did you know about it? And
didn't know anything about it. Didn't know anything about it. The news came. I mean, we got the news like everybody else that this atomic bomb was, we may have gotten some special Navy information about it. We didn't know any more about it than anybody else. This huge devastation occurred in Japan, and that's all we knew about it. And the Japanese surrendered.
When VJ Day came,
Yeah.
where were you and what was
Well, we were in the Bremerton Navy Yard. VJ Day being refitted to be an escort vessel for the invasion of Japan. And as I say, then the Navy, I guess, decided they didn't know what to do with us, so they converted us to a weather ship. I don't remember now what the conversion involved, probably some special instruments.
Did the Navy permit you to kind of celebrate and go?
Oh, yes, oh, yeah. And in fact, Gloria had come out to Seattle, Bremerton, and yeah, the Navy celebrated. In those days, they probably still are, but here I and thousands of other young college guys were naval officers. By that time, I was a lieutenant, and there were officers' clubs where you could buy cigarettes for a nickel a pack and drinks for 15 cents or something like that, and steak dinners for $1. And so we were living it up, relatively speaking, in those days. I think, as I recall, my pay as an officer was $300 and some a month, but that was that was plenty. I lived on the ship,
Yeah.
so. And on the ship, we had the officers. There was a wardroom where the officers ate. The crew all ate out in the regular quarters, but the officers, there was a wardroom and a dining table with a white tablecloth and silver, and we were served by 2 steward's mates who were black. There were no, as I recall, there were no black, or very few at least, black people in the Navy other than as steward's mates or in this kind of subordinate rank. Here again, I'm a young squirt being served dinner by a steward mate in a white jacket, and who cleaned the table and did the dishes, I guess, and made my bunk in the morning. I had a stateroom. Well, there were 2 of us in the stateroom, but that was the steward's mate took care of this. I'm sure the Navy isn't that way today, but I haven't kept up with it. But anyway.
With everything else going on,
Yeah.
do you recall kind of a humorous incident that occurred during your service that sort of stands out, sort of you won't believe the story, Greg?
A humorous incident.
About yourself, some of your service mates?
Humorous. Well, we had a couple of my fellow officers were more adventurous than I guess, and imbibed somewhat more than I did in those days. And I remember one humorous, again, in the Bremerton, I remember whether it was Bremerton or Seattle, but after one night of carousing, and I was not with them, fortunately, there was a locomotive sitting on a railroad tracks on the docks there, and these guys got in it and somehow got it started. But they were able to stop it, and the commandant of the Navy Yard, or whatever it was, when he learned of that, he confined them to our ship. They were not permitted to go ashore as long as, I guess you'd call that somewhat humorous for those of us who weren't directly involved. Well, to be Frank, I had a relatively good time in the Navy. I wasn't shot at. I had good duty. I don't know. The pay was good, and
What was the weather like at the Aleutians?
oh, terrible in the winter. Awful, awful. Huge waves, 30-foot waves, and our ship was relatively small. It was 180 feet, so we really got tossed around in these winter storms. The summer was calm. Oh, one incident that occurred in the Aleutians, we came into Adak, which was our home port in the middle of the chain, and this flashing light came out from the beach. Ensign Lasser, report to Com Norpac or something like that. Well, I didn't have any idea what Ensign Lasser was supposed to, but anyway, the captain sent me ashore, and I went up to headquarters, and the message was from Ernest Leet, who was an attorney here, and who was in the Navy, and he was a lieutenant commander, and he was stationed there, and I guess he had talked to my father or somebody who told him where we were, and so he signaled me, and I came in, and I had dinner at Com Norpac with all the brass. Not that they did anything about me, but they spent the night there and sobered up the next morning and got taken back to the ship. That was interesting. But to run into Ernie Leet there.
Who, by the way, of course, as you know, was a partner of Robert Jackson.
Of Robert Jackson, absolutely, that's right.
He was the Jackson Connect.
It was Jackson, Herrick, Durkin, and Leet. Yeah, and Leet was the young squirt in those days, a recent Harvard Law graduate, or was it Harvard Law, I guess?
Harvard.
Yeah. But
and very much a Republican.
Oh, definitely a Republican. Yeah.
Jackson certainly wasn't.
No, he was. He was an active Republican, as I recall. He was chairman or some official in the Republican Party here. Yeah. Well.
Off camera, I'll tell you about my interview with Mary Leet.
Oh yeah.
About Ernie, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
You then, once you got done with, got mustered out, you went to Columbia.
Yeah, I went to. We were in New York. I got out of the Navy in January of '46, and I wanted to go to law school. And my good friend Sam Price was at Yale Law School at that point. He had just started, but Gloria and I found a very nice one-room apartment in Greenwich Village in New York, and she got a job with a bank there. And so I applied to Columbia Law School, and again I was accepted. So I commuted to law school every day, paid 5 cents to take the Fifth Avenue bus from the village up to the law school, 116th Street. And in those days you went during the summer too, where you could, and so I got out of law school in 2 years. And Gloria had this job at a bank, and she made enough money so that we were able to go out to dinner on Friday nights usually. But her parents, who lived in Brooklyn, would supply us with groceries a lot of the time, yeah. But that was a very pleasant experience, the law school, and then I graduated and came up here and went with the accounting firm that my father and our family had. And
BDO Seidman.
Pardon?
BDO Seidman.
Yeah, well, it was then Seidman and Seidman. And but I was not a CPA, so I went to Bonaventure to get. I had 1 year at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, which qualified me partly, but then I commuted down to St. Bonaventure to take some accounting courses so I could qualify for the exam. And I was fortunate and passed both this bar exam and the CPA exam on the first crack. but my practice was basically a CPA. As a CPA, in fact, a day or two after I was admitted to the bar, I got a phone call in my office, and it was from Clive Wright, who was an attorney. He said, "Miles, would you come down to Surrogate's Court? I'd like to see you for a minute." So I came down, and he said, I got in there, and the surrogate at that time was named Hugh Bodine. Very interesting guy. But in any event, Clive Wright greeted me, and we went up to the bench, and he said, "Your Honor, I want to introduce Miles Lasser, who was just admitted to the bar, and I want to name him. I would like you to appoint him special guardian in this case that's before you." I had no idea what the hell a special guardian was, but I was appointed special guardian, and there was a paper put in front of me, and it said, "Sign this," which I did, and I got a fee of $10 or something like that. That was my first legal fee. But I basically was a CPA and did tax work. Again, in those days, a lot of tax work was sort of beneath lawyers. They didn't, many of them didn't do much or know much about tax work, and CPAs did a lot of the tax, not litigation, but negotiations with the IRS and all that sort of thing, and I did a lot of that.
Did your dad and you have a niche? Was there sort of, I know you talked about the furniture industry,
yeah.
wood, was that how you got, that's how you got started, but
yeah.
As you were practicing the accounting, was there sort of an area which you were known for?
Tax work, basically. I won't necessarily call it litigation, but negotiation with the IRS and that sort of thing, yeah. And tax planning, a lot of tax planning. And estate planning, tax and estate planning. Yeah, and we, in those days, as I say, many lawyers didn't do or know much about tax work. They knew what estate tax was, but they didn't. So our firm did a lot of it, and my father was a great business developer. We had clients all over the place, Buffalo and down into Pennsylvania and Olean and Erie. So he developed a pretty major practice here.
He was also, wasn't he the personal accountant also for Isabella Marvin Sheldon?
Oh yes. My father was, I would say he was basically responsible in a sense for the Sheldon Foundation in that he persuaded Isabella Sheldon to, there were two Sheldon children. The daughter, geez, that's terrible, and the son, Ralph Jr. But they had no children, and it was quite obvious that they were not going to have children. So my father was somewhat influential in persuading Isabella to start the Sheldon Foundation, leaving her estate into two trusts, one for Ralph and one for the daughter, whose name, what can't I remember? But anyway, and on their deaths, those trusts were to go to the Sheldon Foundation. And she also left a little money directly to the foundation, just to have a starting point. And the original, the First National, the Sheldon Bank then was what was in the First National Bank here, and that didn't have any trust department. So she selected, I think it was what was then the Hanover Bank in New York as trustee. And that was the start. And my father was one of the directors of the Sheldon Foundation, along with Wilson Price and some others, and of course Isabella Sheldon. And that's how the Sheldon Foundation started, and it was from a charitable point of view, was relatively small in those early days. It didn't have much. Of course, Isabella gave personal money to charities, and it wasn't until her death and then the deaths of both why can't I think of the daughter's name? I mean, I knew her well. But in any event, on their deaths, the Sheldon came into the bulk of the foundation, and by that time it had grown considerably through investments and that sort of thing. And it got into the $30 and $40 million category. I mean, it was a major institution for Jamestown, at least, the Jamestown area. And I like to say that Jamestown was blessed with a lot of wealthy people who died without children, because they're the Gebby and the other foundation, Hultquist, or if they died with children, the children had no children of their own. In any event, so the foundations came into existence, and we've been very fortunate, I don't have to tell you, in Jamestown and this whole area to have these foundations. They've been wonderful.
Well, you were involved in the Sheldon Foundation in many forms for over 30 years.
Yeah, I was not, of course it was relatively small for a long time, because the two children were, as long as they were alive, the foundation itself didn't have relatively that much money. But on their deaths, and it became major. And I don't remember now how I became director, but I was just kind of an interim director. And several years ago, Linda Swanson became director. And of course, Sheldon's now a major factor in this area, a major institution. I'm wandering around here,
well,
Greg.
Hey, what you've done, you touched so many points, Miles, and I know you're humble about the whole thing, but just think about the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation.
Yeah.
You were there at the beginning. Sweeney would have been nothing without you.
Yeah, well, that was interesting. Randy Sweeney happens to be here in the background. But yeah, that was, there was a banker who we all remember, John Hamilton, in those days, and he was involved with the Gebby Foundation. He was director of it, but he was pushing for a community foundation, and he got Ken Strickler and I and a few other people together, Betty Linnae and John Selstrom and pardon? Sam Price, yes. Anyway, we had discussions, and we finally formed the community foundation. We started out with about $1,000. I don't remember where it came from. Maybe John contributed it from the Gebby Foundation, but it was very small. And I don't remember when Randy's here. I don't remember when he came aboard, but it started growing, and of course it's now a very major institution, and a very complex institution in the sense that I don't know how many scholarship funds it has, hundreds of them. So the accounting there must be very complex. But anyway, it's become a major institution here, thanks to Randy, and some of our original founders became directors, but we're all emeritus now.
You also, you're intimately involved with Jamestown Community College.
Yes, Mayor, I think it was Mayor Whitehead, back in the, I don't know, early 70s appointed me as a trustee of the community college. And I was there when Paul Benke became president. But then I was appointed to the State University Board of Trustees, so I resigned from the JCC board, and that was an interesting experience in Albany. And I made it my mission to be a advocate for community colleges on that board, and I think I had some success with it. Not that that they were not a major part of the board, but I think community colleges have more and more come into their own now. I haven't been on the on the board, foundation board now for probably 20 years. I mean, the State University Board. Interesting experience.
We talked a little bit, of course, a lot about the World War II, and that's part of
Yeah.
the program here. Is there one thing that you kind of learned during the war, sort of
Yeah.
a skill set that sort of served you well in your life here as a professional in the community? Was there something that you gleaned from the service that was a takeaway?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that, Greg. I guess I learned in one sense to know my place. I don't mean that I was downplaying myself, but I sort of, I think I earned or learned something about tactful disposition. Don't be combative all the time, and except when you're arguing with the IRS. But that's a good question. I have to think about that.
Is that why you became a radio musical commentator,
Well,
WKTN?
Oh, you're bringing that up. No, I had, back in the 30s, when I and my friends were in high school and college, jazz, swing, and such were the big thing, and we all became real swing fans, and I certainly was one. I mean, we'd listen to recordings, we'd go anywhere. I remember one time, Benny Goodman, who was in the top, he had given his Carnegie Hall, famous Carnegie Hall concert, and he was coming to Buffalo to appear at an armory in Buffalo. And I and some of my friends decided we were going to go and hear that. It was a weeknight, a school night, and we had a driver. I mean, we didn't drive ourselves. I mean, it was perfectly it wasn't a binge or anything like that. We were going for the music. But my parents said, oh, it's a school night, you shouldn't go. Well, I was determined I was going to go, so I left high school, I don't know, 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Sam Price's parents permitted him to go and take their car, and we had an adult driver for the car. I mean, it was very, no alcohol involved or anything. So I went to Sam's, and we took off for Buffalo and went to the Goodman concert, and it was wonderful. And we got home about 2 in the morning, I guess. No drinking or anything, it was just strictly the music. And my parents, to put it mildly, were somewhat cool toward me. But that's an unforgettable experience. But in any event, I had been interested in jazz and swing music, and I don't know, going on the radio, I don't remember exactly why I guess I was talking to Cy Goldman or somebody about it. Cy, then the owner of the radio station, WJTN. And he said, well, you can come on Sunday night for an hour. So I did, and that was a lot of fun. I guess that program went on about 10 years, And it was a lot of fun for me. And one of my great compliments, I was in the hospital. I had some kind of relatively minor surgical procedure, and I was in a hospital bed in a room. And this woman came in, who I didn't know, and said, "Are you Miles Lasser?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you how much I enjoyed your radio program." That was the greatest compliment I ever received in my life. But anyway, I guess I just did. I don't remember how many years that was on. It was a lot of fun. I still have all. I still have all the scripts because I wrote out. I didn't just talk. I mean, the comments were mostly written out, and it was a lot of fun. But popular music has passed me by now. I'm not with it at all. What is known as, whatever popular music is today, I'm not part of it.
You're at the Jackson Center today, and I know that
Yeah.
you had a kind of a Robert Jackson moment, certainly at the funeral of Robert Jackson.
Oh,
I know
yeah.
you told the story, but tell it again for the camera.
Well, Jackson died in 53, was it?
54.
54. And of course, his funeral was here, and it was a big, major event, as you know. The Supreme Court itself came, the governor came, and the actual funeral service was at St. Luke's Church. And I was, again, I was admitted to the bar at that time, although I didn't practice law. I was also a CPA, and my credentials, I mean, I was publicly a CPA, but I was a member of the bar and the Bar Association. But I did not go to the funeral service. But after the funeral service, the local Bar Association had a luncheon for the Supreme Court at Moonbrook. So I went up to Moonbrook early. I didn't go to the funeral service itself. And I was the only one there. I went in, came into Moonbrook, and there was nobody there. So I just stood around and waited for people to come. And I think, I don't know, I've told you this, and out of nowhere appeared this tall guy. He looks around, he sees me, and he comes over and sticks his hand out, says, "Hello, I'm Earl Warren." As though I didn't recognize him. But and then the rest of the court came in, and all the local lawyers and all that. And that was a wonderful, memorable experience at luncheon, because each member of the court had a group around him. I don't think there were any female members of the group. No, there weren't at that time. But there was Frankfurter and Douglas and, well, the whole court was there. They arrived on a special railway train. And that was a very memorable experience.
You remember who you sat with?
I don't, Craig. It wasn't Earl Warren, though.
What did you say? So Earl Warren sticks out his hand and says, "Hi, I'm Earl Warren."
I
What's
said,
Miles
I
Lasser?"
said, "I'm Miles Lasser." Welcome, or something like that. And I think he determined that I was not one of the influential people, so he turned around and went back to, at that time the rest of the court was coming in and others, so he started mingling.
Did your dad have any relations with Jackson?
My dad?
Yeah.
Oh yes, very close. They had quite a few similar clients, I mean the same clients, and they were good friends. In fact, my father would go to Washington every so often, and he'd always, not always, but usually would call on Jackson, who was in on the court. And Jackson was very candid, apparently. I mean, he and my father must have been pretty good friends, because my father would tell me that Jackson would sound off about Black. You know, they were kind of competitors for the chief justiceship, and feelings between them weren't great, and I guess Jackson would talk about that, but yeah, he'd visit quite a bit with Jackson, yeah. You know, I probably met Jackson, but I don't recall if I ever did meet him, really. Of course, I knew who he was, but, yeah.
Well, just Jackson Center, both you and Gloria have been intimately involved from the beginning.
Yeah.
Various forms. In fact, Gloria was probably Raleigh's
Yeah.
de facto secretary.
Yeah, well, she was the phone answerer. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's back when Raleigh was running it. Yeah. Well, it has made some great progress thanks to you and many other people. I think it's wonderful. This has become a great institution here, and it's going to continue as that and grow. Yep. Thanks to you and others, but.
Well, thank you. And, as we kind of wrap this part up, is there a kind of a walk away when you look back at all public service you've done and all the private activities? Is there sort of a Miles Lasser, I hate to use the term legacy, but is there one? Is there something you're most proud of?
I don't know. Maybe I'm over modest, but I don't. Other than the fact that if you look on a list of names, you'll find my name on it, but directors or whatever. Well, I would like to think that I made some contribution to the city. We haven't talked about it, but I was a city councilman in the Stan Lundeen days. Stan, when he was going to run for mayor, asked me and others, Rand Chadwick and others, to run on his ticket, and I thought, oh, that's ridiculous. But in thinking about it, I decided I'd do it, and I did, and we won. And I think we did some good here. I served for 2 terms, and then I didn't run again. But that was I think Stan's administration kind of changed, I don't know about changed, but opened up the direction of Jamestown, set us on a new path. And those days on the council were interesting. There were 10 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The 2 Republicans, at least when I was first elected, were John Champion and Warren Erickson. John Champion was a black Raleigh kidder. John Champion was a black classmate, high school classmate of mine. He was a Republican, and Warren Erickson. And Warren was the spokesman for the other side, but we completely dominated, the Democrats completely dominated that. I think the city made some progress during the Lundeen.
The urban renewal time period?
Yeah. And that was, they were just getting started on the retail development along Fairmount. And I remember John Champion said, they're out to kill bigelows. I remember, and they were successful at that. Yeah. But I think I don't know. I'd like to think we're starting on some sort of a comeback here for the area. Maybe we ought to become a metropolitan area. But I don't think Bus-Dye wants us involved. You're a Bus-Dye resident.
You live in the town of Bus-Dye, Village of Lakewood, that's right.
Yeah.
You're probably right.
Yeah.
This has been great, Miles.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm flattered to be talked to, interviewed, or I don't know whether interviewed, have a discussion with. I don't know what else I can say.
Well, you're a rock star.
A rock star.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Now you can have the coffee and the tidbits.